I've been involved in gospel work now for about 45 years. And I've seen a lot of things happen in that time. But one thing I've learned, one thing I've noticed is that I have failed to see the value in working separately and independently from the body of believers, at least in the sense that we are not maximizing our efforts. I'm not saying that something isn't getting done when we're working by ourselves or independently, but not like God wants it to be, not like God's plan is for us. I don't know if some of you are familiar with the Amish people, but they work and live together as a community. And if one of the Amish brethren needs a barn built, they will come together from many areas around, all the men folk and the women as well. And the men folk will work building the barn. The women folk will prepare food to feed them while they're building the barn. And they'll start with nothing, and in about 10 hours, they will have a completed barn. There will be a master worker, an architect among the group who does this, and he has a vision of what this barn is going to look like, and then he will order and direct the different men who are there on, some are going to be framing the walls, and some are going to be putting the roof on, and others will be doing different parts. But they're all working together in a unified way, and they accomplish in just 10 hours what one man could not do in a year's time hardly by himself, or maybe ever could accomplish by himself at that time. Here's a picture of some ants, and we know the ants are quite strong workers, aren't they? And here we see them bridging from one leaf or section of plantation to another. And it's a gap that no one ant could get across by themselves, but they are making a ant bridge, if you please, a living bridge from one leaf to another for the others to pass over by. And they're working together, doing something they could never accomplish alone. I don't know about you, but I like honey, and honey's come from honeybees mostly. And I understand it would take one honeybee, I think it's 3 or 4 trips all the way around the world in gathering honey to make 1 pound of honey. It takes a lot of work to make a pound of honey, and one bee just can't do it. But these bees, they work together. Here's another picture. These are some of my bees that I had a couple years ago. But they work together, and they work well, and they have value because they work together like this. I want to just share some spiritual thoughts that someone has penned concerning this that I think are well spoken, and so I'm going to use those words instead of my own. But it says, the wisest of men may learn useful lessons from the ways and habits of the little creatures of the earth. The industrious bee gives to men of intelligence an example that they would do well to imitate. These insects observe perfect order, and no idler is allowed in the hive. Did you get that? They observe perfect order. And then it continues. They execute their appointed work with an intelligence and activity that are beyond our comprehension. The ant, which we consider as only pests to be crushed under our feet, are in many respects superior to man, for he does not as wisely improve the gifts of God. The wise man calls our attention to the smallest of the earth, and now we have quotation from Proverbs. Go to the ant, thou sluggard, and consider her ways, and be wise, which having no guide, overseer, or ruler, provideth her meat in the summer, and gathereth her food in the harvest. The ants are a people not strong, yet they prepare their meat in the summer. And then this writer continues, we may learn from these little teachers a lesson of faithfulness. Should we improve with the same diligence the faculties which an all-wise Creator has bestowed upon us, how greatly would our capacities for usefulness be increased? God's eye is upon the smallest of his creatures. Does he not then regard man formed in his image and require of him corresponding returns for all the advantages he has given him? And I think that God does. I think God does. The ant is faithful to what God has made it to do. The bee is faithful to what God has made it to do. Are we faithful to what God has called us to do? And fundamentally, God has called us to do two things. He's called us to live for His honor and glory, and He's called us to share that truth about Him and His goodness to others. And He wants us to do this intelligently and effectively. And for this to happen, there needs to be order. There needs to be organization. Can you imagine what it would be like in the ant hive if all the ants just did what they wanted to on their own? Now, they have no seemingly ruler over them, but they are guided, as it were, by the hand of God, by the instinct that God has put within them, and they know what to do and how to work together. And we who claim to be so much more intelligent than an ant, all we can do is fuss and feud and complain among each other and don't seem to know how to work together. In 1 Corinthians chapter 14, the Apostle Paul gives us some counsel. And in verse 40 particularly, he says, "Let all things be done decently and in order." How many things? All things should be done decently in order. There is to be an order in God's church. There's to be an order in the way you do your kitchen, ladies. There's to be an order in the way you guys have your garages. We may not all be there yet. We're working on it. Sometimes these things are a work in progress, right? But this is how you work efficiently. If you want to help someone to have an efficient house, you probably have to, in many cases, get rid of most of the clutter they have, because the clutter keeps us from being efficient. But all things are to be done decently in order. In verse 33 of this same chapter, Paul says there that for God is not the author of what? Confusion. Remember that word. But of peace, as in all churches of the saints. It says God is not the author of confusion. But the way to avoid confusion is to have order and organization, friends. Now, interestingly, this word confusion, it comes from a Greek word, akatasia, and it means confusion or upheaval. In fact, according to one lexicon, it says to rise up in open defiance of authority with the presumed intent to overthrow it, or to act in complete opposition to its demands, to rebel against, to revolt, to engage in insurrection, rebellion. We've heard that word insurrection here in America lately, haven't we? And there is such a thing as insurrection and rising up against authority. And Paul here says in 1 Corinthians 14 and verse 33 that God is not the author of confusion. He's not the author of rebellion, of that which tries to do its own thing. Now, in the Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew chapter 6, in the prayer that he gave us, this model prayer, in Matthew 6 and verse 10, part of that prayer says, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done in earth as it is in heaven." And you wonder, what does that really mean, Jesus? What do you mean when you say that? Thy will be done in earth as it is in heaven. Well, for us to pray intelligently, we sort of have to know what we're praying about. We have to know what we're praying toward, don't we? And so if we want God's will done on this earth, we sort of have to have an understanding of what God's will is in heaven, don't we? Because if it's to be done in earth as it is in heaven, we need to know what's going on in heaven. How is heaven structured? How is heaven done? Well, there's this statement in volume 6 of the Testimonies on page 200 in paragraph 2. It says, "Order is heaven's first law." Order is heaven's first law. In other words, is heaven a place of confusion? No, not at all. Heaven is a very ordered place, friends. It's structured. In Testimonies, Volume 4, on page 429, it says, "In heaven there is perfect order, perfect obedience, perfect peace and harmony. Those who have had no respect for order or discipline in this life would have no respect for the order which is observed in heaven. They can never be admitted into heaven, for all worthy of an entrance there will love order and respect discipline." Think about that. You know, in a home, the Bible, in Ephesians, Paul speaks about the husbands loving the wife and the wife honoring or respecting the husband. There's those two great qualities there again coming up. But it says that those who go into heaven, they're going to love order and they're going to respect discipline both. So if I don't love order, if I don't have respect for discipline, I shouldn't expect to enter into a place that's going to be the eternal nature of it. No, if I don't like those things, God's not going to put me in heaven and force me to like those things that I don't like. Now, again, we're talking about order, organization. We're talking about a combined working effort of the people, because that's what the order produces, is a combined working effort. And in the book of Leviticus, I think God gives us an interesting lesson in Leviticus 26 and verse 8. If you turn to Leviticus 26 and verse 8 in your scriptures, God was telling those people, if you will obey me, if you will be obedient to me, I will bless you so abundantly. And here are some of the things that are going to happen as a result of my blessing you. And in Leviticus 26 and verse 8, he says, and 5 of you shall chase 100, and 100 of you shall put 10,000 to flight, and your enemies shall fall before you by the sword. Now notice there's some numbers here. There's 4 numbers given. The number 5, the number 100, and then the number 100 again, and then the number 10,000. And I have a little bit of a mathematical background, so I'm just looking at this mathematically. But 5 to 100 is like, it can be produced as a fraction, and that fraction can be reduced to its simplest form, creating a ratio, and that ratio ends up to being 1 to 20. So if 5 can put 100 to flight, that means like the equivalent of 1 is doing 20. Okay, got it? But notice he says after that 100 of you will put 10,000 to flight. But of course, that's got a lot of zeros, and we can reduce those zeros out, and it comes down to 1 to 100. 1 puts 100 to flight. What is he saying? He's saying that the more we work together, the more of us we have working together, the more efficient we can become. If there's only 5 of us, we can deal with 100 people. If we get 20 times that, we can do, it's going to increase proportionally, much greater. And so this is important for us to understand, because we're here to finish the work. And working together, we can do things that, friends, we could never, never, never do separately and apart. Now, that doesn't mean that we can just, everybody band together that has all kinds of strange ideas and doctrines and methods of worship and ways of working. No, we need to have unity, and unity is a wonderful thing as God's people's pressed together. We are told in Psalms 133 and verse 1, behold how good and how pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity. Amen? It is true. It is good. And it's interesting that the Hebrew word translated pleasant in this verse is a synonym for sweet. The Hebrew word is a synonym for sweet. Now, we all like honey, I think. I have some honeybees, and maybe one day I'll get some honey from them. I don't know. But most people do like honey. We like things that taste sweet. We like a nice ripe watermelon or whatever the sweetest fruit that you like. Maybe it's mango or something. But mango, okay, good. But that's how the Bible describes what brethren dwelling together in unity is like. It's something sweet. It's a nice experience. He says that that they dwell together in unity. And the word where it speaks about being united here means that we're all united as one. In other words, friends, we are not to be independent atoms out there. Independent atoms out there. I suppose one of the most helpful, needful substances we have on this earth is called water. Water. It's pretty good stuff. You know, you don't have a water atom, do you? You have water molecules. Molecules are groups of atoms charged and working together to produce something else. This is made of hydrogen and oxygen. Such an interesting combination, the way God did that. Have you ever thought about it? You know, hydrogen is very combustive, very explosive. And oxygen is a catalyst to make things burn. And we put them together and we use it to put out a fire. Isn't that interesting? How God did that. In volume 6 of the Testimonies on page 172.2, it says, students should be taught that they are not independent atoms, but that each one is a thread which is to unite with other threads in composing a fabric. So we're not to be, as people, just independent here, there. We're to be part of a fabric. We're all threads, as it were. We're all individuals. There's nothing wrong with being an individual. God doesn't want us to cease to be individuals. But we're to be in a common fabric together. And then this analogy has been brought out, I think, quite well. It says, an army in battle would become confused and weakened unless all worked in concert. If the soldiers should act out their own impulsive ideas without reference to each other's positions and work, they would be a collection of independent atoms. They could not do the work of an organized body, so the soldiers of Christ must act how? In harmony. That means not independent. For those who have studied a little history of the United States, you know that in the 19th century there was a war between the northern states and the southern states in America. And although the northern states had superior numbers, superior materials and things to work with, they couldn't seem to subdue the South. They couldn't do it. And the main reason was that the Southern Army had far superior generals. They had the superior generals. And those generals knew how to order their men to fight the best. And so even though they had inferior numbers, inferior equipment, and many times even inferior positions, they would rout and, or at least hold at bay the northern armies. And it wasn't until the northern armies got better generals could they win the war. Continuing in that statement I just was reading from, they alone must not be cherished. If they do this, the Lord's people, in the place of being in perfect harmony, of one mind, one purpose, and consecrated to one grand object, will find efforts fruitless, their time and capacities wasted. Union is strength. A few converted souls acting in harmony, acting for one grand purpose under one head, will achieve victories at every encounter. And who is that one head that we should all be coming under? Christ. Absolutely, Christ. Now, I mentioned a little bit ago, just put a seed of thought in your mind, that we just can't maybe form a kind of a union with people who have many different ideas or philosophies on how to worship and all. And I just want to show you some scriptures concerning some of these points. The first one is in Ephesians chapter 4. Ephesians 4, verses 4 through 6. He says, there is one body and one Spirit, even as you are called in one hope of your calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is above all and through all and in you all. Now, we have a goal as in Christianity, and that fundamental goal is to take over the world. We don't want to do it with force. We don't want to do it with cannons and rifles and guns. But we'd like to convert the world to Christianity, wouldn't we? Isn't that really what we want to do? You know, the Muslims have the same idea. The Muslims have the same idea. They want to convert the world. So could we just work with the Muslims to convert the world? Well, of course we couldn't. And you say, Alan, that's a ridiculous kind of an illustration. But you know, sometimes we take extremes in illustrations to make a point. Because the Christian, the Muslim, even though they claim to worship the one same true God, they have such vastly different views of that one God. They have such vastly different ideas of how to worship that one true God and what that one true God expects. There is absolutely no way that we as Christians can work with Muslim people in evangelism. Okay? It just can't be done. But if we take that down a little further, you know, there has to be some kind of a common denominator of where we can begin to work and where we can't work with people. There are certain fundamental principles that are taught in the Bible. Now, we use this name in our group, 1889, and I know to a lot of people that probably doesn't make a lot of sense. Okay? But it goes back to a date and a time when there was a unified group of Adventist people who had a fundamental understanding of the principles, the bedrock principles that Christianity is really about. And they unified on those biblical truths. And that's how they could work together. But this text tells us in verse 5, one Lord, one faith. Not many faiths. I don't know how many official or unofficial denominations there are of Christians in the world, but there's thousands now. Thousands. But there's supposed to be one faith, not five faiths, not the Baptist faith, not the Methodist faith, not the Adventist faith. One faith. It's the faith of Jesus. In 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 15, Paul, writing to his son in the faith, says this, "But if I tarry long, that thou mayest know how thou oughtest to behave thyself in the house of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and ground of truth," or the pillar and the stay of truth. In other words, the church of God, it should be where truth is held, is cherished, and protected. But what is the standard for truth? What is the one standard for truth? It's the Word of God, isn't it? So if for instance, I'm studying with someone and they say, we'd like for you to come to my church. And I said, well, that's great. Let's talk about this, And I would look at the biblical doctrines or the doctrines and say, does your church teach this? Does it teach that? Does it not teach something? I was talking with an individual this week, and he said, I'm not Trinitarian. He said, but I go to a church that's Trinitarian. Wow, that's pretty interesting. That's interesting. Sort of a type of a Pentecostal church he was involved in. But that's interesting, isn't it? Because when you come together, are you really worshiping the same God if you have a different God, right? The issue is really, though, not what any church teaches. The issue is what does the Bible say about it. And of course, we just read a text here in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 6, one God and Father of all. It didn't say three gods. It didn't say, whatever. We might look at the issue of worship. We might think about the issue of the day of worship. Several years ago, my father, when he was living, and he was more of a, I hate to say probably atheist, he might have had a flavor of agnosticism in him. I hope he had a little bit of questioning. But he asked my brother one time, who was Sunday keeping minister. He said, this Saturday, Sunday issue. He said, who's right, you or your brother? And my brother responded to him. He said, technically, Alan's right, but it doesn't matter. He says, technically, Alan is right, but it doesn't matter. Well, I want to ask you a question. If God tells us something, and God tells us to obey something, and God tells us to do something, do I have a right? Is it wise for me to say, it doesn't matter? When God gives a command, does it matter? God gave a command that the Ark of the Covenant, when it was to be moved in a very prescribed way. There were staves that went through rings on that ark that the priests were to lift that ark by the staves, and they were to carry it upon their shoulders. A very prescribed way. But one day, when David wanted to move the ark, they had prepared a new ox cart. Not an old ox cart, a new one, a new cart. And they were going to move the ark on a new cart. And God had to strike down a man who touched the ark because it was going to fall, or it was wobbling on that cart one day, because he wasn't supposed to be anywhere near it. He could have said, it doesn't matter. And in fact, I'm sure that's exactly what he thought. It doesn't matter. But friends, when God said it, it did matter. It did matter. When God told Saul, King Saul, to go and destroy Amalek and destroy everything that's there, do you think he meant it? Saul found out he meant it. He lost his kingdom over that. When God says the seventh day is the Sabbath, friends, that's exactly what he meant. And the papal church had no right to try to change the date or the day of the Sabbath. But this is a change that they have openly, proudly even confessed, that they are responsible for almost all of Christendom today worshiping on Sunday. And they will say, and I've had Catholic priests tell me directly, that this is a sign that the Protestants are really under the Catholics because they keep the Sunday. No, the Bible says that the church of the living God is the pillar and ground of truth. And so God wants the people working together, but they have to be working under the banner of truth. As it says in Amos chapter 3 and verse 3, can two walk together except they be agreed? And of course, the implied answer is you can't. You can't. When I was younger in grade school, we would have field day at the end of the year. And one thing I liked to participate with one of my best friends, Alan Terrell at the time, was the three-legged race. You know, where they tie two of your legs together and you got to race down to the field. And if you don't work together, if you don't walk together, you fall. You don't get very far, you know. And so that's really important that we walk together. In 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 16 and 17, Paul says, "And what agreement hath the temple of God with idols? For ye are the temple of the living God, as God said, I will dwell in them and walk in them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Wherefore, come out from among them, and be ye separate, saith the Lord, and touch not the unclean thing, and I will receive you." God, friends, nowhere in his word gives us a license to work with idolaters or people who are contrary, living contrary to the word of God. We have a job to evangelize people like that, to teach them the truth, to help them to become part of God's people. But they are not just part of God's people because we choose to work with people. And so we need unity, but we need unity based upon biblical truth. This statement says Christ calls for unity, but he does not call for us to unify on wrong practices. The God of heaven draws a sharp contrast between pure, elevating, ennobling truth and false, misleading doctrines. He calls sin and impenitence by the right name. He does not gloss over wrongdoing with a coat of untempered mortar. I urge our brethren to unify upon a true, what? Scriptural basis. A true scriptural basis. It says that God draws a contrast, and not just a contrast, but he draws a sharp contrast between pure, elevating, ennobling truth and that which is error. In Gospel Workers on page 487.1, oh, how Satan would rejoice if he could succeed in his efforts to get in among this people and disorganize the work at a time when thorough organization is essential and will be the greatest power to keep out spurious uprisings and to refute claims not endorsed by the Word of God. Whenever you have disorganization, you can be sure Satan is there helping with this. Because he knows that when we have good organization together, people will work effectively, and it will work as a safeguard because we have balances and checks one with another. You know, if you put a man out working by himself alone, he can come up with all kinds of ideas, and there's no one there to say, wait a minute, brother, you're starting to go down the wrong path. Put a check on this idea. Think about this. Look at this. Look at this verse. See what this one says. It's a dangerous thing. Now, I'd like to share with you a couple paragraphs from a book called Acts of the Apostles. Now, it's not the Acts of the Apostles that we have right after the Gospel of John and before Romans, but this is a book about the life of the apostles, and it makes a lot of sense what this author is saying here. And I'm going to begin here. It says, God has made his church on earth a channel of light, and through it he communicates his purposes and his will. He does not give to one of his servants an experience independent of and contrary to the experience of the church itself. He does not give one man a knowledge of his will for the entire church, while the church, Christ's body, is left in darkness. Continuing. In God's providence, he places his servants in close connection with his church in order that they may have less confidence in themselves and greater confidence in others whom he is leading out to advance his work. Continuing. There have ever been in the church those who are constantly inclined toward individual independence. They seem unable to realize that independence of spirit is liable to lead the human agent to have too much confidence in himself and to trust in his own judgment rather than to respect the counsel and highly esteem the judgment of his brethren, especially of those in the offices that God has appointed for the leadership of his people. Continuing. God has invested his church with special authority and power, which no one can be justified in disregarding and despising, for he who does this despises the voice of God. But remember again, before I go on, remember again that the church of the living God is the pillar and ground of truth. If you have a group that claims to be the church, there's all kinds of different groups. You have your Assembly of God, your Church of God, Church of the Living God, Church of Christ. We have Adventists, Baptists and Catholic, so many of these people, and they claim to be, we're Church of God, or we're part of the Church of God. But friends, if it doesn't have truth, if it's not based and grounded in truth, and I would also add, I think accurately, if we're not living that truth, then that cannot be accepted as God's people. They're people God loves, people God's trying to help, for sure. Those who are inclined to regard their individual judgment as supreme are in grave peril. It is Satan's studied effort. What kind of an effort? Studied effort to separate such ones from those who are channels of light, through whom God has wrought to build up and extend his work in the earth. To neglect or despise those whom God has appointed to bear the responsibilities of leadership in connection with the advancement of truth is to reject the means that he has ordained for the help, encouragement, and strength of his people. For any worker in the Lord's cause to pass these by and to think that his light must come through no other channel than directly from God is to place himself in a position where he is liable to be deceived by the enemy and overthrown. In other words, friends, don't think you can't learn something from someone else. If I think that no one can teach me anything, I am setting myself up for deception. One more slide on this. The Lord in his wisdom has arranged that by means of the close relationship that should be maintained by all believers, Christian shall be united to Christian and church to church. Thus, the human instrumentality will be enabled to cooperate with the divine. Every agency will be subordinate to the Holy Spirit, and all the believers will be united in an organized and well-directed effort to give to the world the glad tidings of the grace of Christ. Now, I want you to notice in the first part of this statement, or in the upper third of it, it says, Christian shall be united to Christian and church to church. When Christians are united with Christians, local Christians are united together, that forms a local church. And so if we are to be united together, then no one has a right to defy what God has planned for them. They can do that. God will let them do it. But they're not in harmony with God. And so I can say, I don't want to be a member of any church, no matter what the church is. I want to just be independent out to myself. But that's not in accordance with what God has called. And we can have a local church group. Okay? Maybe we come together and we have a local church group. We're just fine being alone. We don't need anyone else with us. But not only is Christian to be united with Christian, but the churches, the local churches are to be united with other churches. And this was the way it was in the New Testament time. You had a church at Ephesus, you had a church at Philippi, you had a church at Colossae, you had churches throughout the province of Galatia, you had churches at Rome, and Paul would send an epistle to this church, and he would also send it to that one. He would send an epistle to Laodicea, and he said, read this epistle to the Colossians that I've sent to Laodicea, and so on. And when there was a famine and when there was a need, all the churches worked together. They sent funds to Jerusalem. When they had a general council, they all sent representatives. They didn't believe that they could function as independent atoms. And I don't think we can either. Now, if we are not for gospel order and working with others because we do not trust others, then it is a way, in a way, we are thinking or we are admitting that we know so much more than others, and we should be the only ones that God can trust on earth. And I just don't believe that God has allowed his work to come down to the place that only one man's smart enough to do the work. I think God has many men, many women who know and can help. The church can be a home church. There's local churches. There's combined groups of churches. When Paul was writing to Corinth, he says, unto the church of God, which is at Corinth. There was a church at Corinth, a body of believers at Corinth. But when he was writing to Galatia, as I made reference to earlier, he says, and all the brethren which are with me unto the churches of Galatia. Again, because Ephesus was a city, but Galatia was like a province or a state, and so there are many churches throughout it. These churches together. The church is not just and can never be a single person. I'm not the church. I can be a part of the church and should be a part of the church. This word that we translate church in the New Testament, ecclesia, I just want to read to you something very interesting from the Louw-Nida lexicon about it. Though some persons have tried to see in the term ecclesia a more or less literal meaning of called out ones, this type of etymologizing is not warranted either by the meaning of ecclesia in New Testament times or even by its earlier usage. The term ecclesia, now this is just going to tell you the history of it. Listen to this. The term ecclesia was in common use for several hundred years before the Christian era and was used to refer to an assembly of persons constituted by well-defined membership. Did you get that? Like there's a group called the Assembly of God, and they've used the term assembly instead of Church of God. That's fine. Because this word that we translate church, it was translated or understood to be an assembly. But it was understood to be an assembly of persons constituted by well-defined membership. Isn't that interesting? In other words, it's just not an invisible thing out there and you might belong and no one know it. That wasn't what it was. And so, friends, if we are not a member in a well-defined way of a church, someplace, a local church, or if it has to be a virtual church today, then we're really not fulfilling the purpose of the church that God has for us. We should be members of a specific church someplace. And then that church should be a member of a sisterhood of churches someplace. And so I invite you, if you're not a member of a church someplace and you'd like to be a member of a specific church, we have a home here at Smyrna, We believe that we're teaching the truth of God. And if we weren't, then we shouldn't be here. We should be out somewhere looking for it, right? And if you believe those fundamental core principles that we believe the Bible teaches and stands for, then we invite you to come be a part and work with us and help us. And we as a church are wanting to work with as many other sister churches as we can in every way possible. This is God's plan for us, friends. And the closer we get to the end of time, the more necessary it becomes for us to follow the plan of God to get this work done. There's coming a time, I believe, and I'm not alone in this belief, that all of the work that we're going to do is going to go underground in America and probably everywhere else in the world. The governments will become oppressive. You will not be allowed to say or to teach or to pass out literature. You won't be able to have meetings like this. And it's going to be harder to do things then when we don't have the organization that we have today and the opportunities for order today. And so we should do as much as we can, while we can, because the work is only going to be harder to do later. I encourage each one of you to consider these words and to obey the Word of God.